Night turned orange. The sky trembled under the sound of naval guns pounding the coast, hour after hour, until even the waves themselves glowed with fire. This was Saipan, the jewel of Japan's Pacific defense line, an island they believed could never fall. To the Japanese high command, it was the shield of the empire, the last wall before the homeland itself. But in June 1944, that shield was about to be shattered. Saipan lay 1,300 miles from Tokyo, close enough for American bombers to finally strike the Japanese mainland. That made it priceless. The Imperial Army knew it. So did the Americans. The Japanese had fortified it for years. Bunkers carved deep into volcanic rock, tank traps buried in coral sand, caves filled with ammunition and food to last for months. 30,000 soldiers under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, sworn to die before surrender. They believed Saipan was untouchable, that no army could ever breach it. They were wrong. On June 13, 1944, the horizon darkened with steel. 500 ships, battleships, cruisers, carriers, stretching from end to end of the sea. Over 71,000 American troops, mostly from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, backed by the 27th Infantry Division, all under Admiral Raymond Spruance and Lieutenant General Howland Mad Smith. For 2 days, the fleet rained hell onto the island. 15-inch shells from battleships Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania slammed into the beaches. The air smelled of smoke and salt and burnt oil. From offshore, sailors said Saipan looked like it was being peeled apart by fire. But under all that destruction, the Japanese were still there, waiting. Their bunkers had survived, their guns were aimed, and they knew exactly where the Americans would land. At dawn on June 15th, the sea filled with landing craft. The first wave of Marines crouched in their Higgins boats, helmets low, faces set like stone. They had been told Saipan was just another island, another stepping stone in the long march to Japan. They didn't know they were heading straight into one of the deadliest beach assaults of the Pacific War. The order came through the radio, "Land the landing force." Engines roared, steel doors dropped, and instantly, the world exploded. Japanese artillery zeroed in from the cliffs above Kanoa Beach. Mortar shells turned the surf red. Machine gun fire tore through the first wave before they even touched sand. Landing craft caught fire. Men jumped into water slick with fuel and blood, swimming through burning waves just to reach the shore. Flamethrowers hissed in the distance, trying to clear pillboxes that refused to die. Tanks bogged down in the sand. Engineers fought to cut through barbed wire under fire so heavy that their helmets rang like bells. By noon, Saipan looked like hell itself had risen from the ocean. The 2nd Marine Division fought its way off the beach, yard by yard, while the 4th Division struggled to break through Japanese lines hidden in cane fields and ravines. Every advance came at the cost of another company. Officers were killed faster than they could give orders. Still, the Marines kept coming. Behind them, naval guns thundered non-stop. Overhead, dive bombers screamed down on enemy positions, blowing craters so close that dirt and shrapnel showered the front lines. And through all of it, the noise, the smoke, the chaos, the Japanese refused to break. By nightfall, the Americans held only a thin strip of land, 2 miles deep, 3 miles wide. But they were ashore. The impenetrable island had been breached. The Japanese counterattack came at dusk. From the cane fields and gullies, they surged forward, hundreds of men shouting, bayonets flashing, trying to drive the Marines back into the sea. The Marines stood their ground. Every rifle, every machine gun, every flamethrower came alive. Tracer fire cut through the dark. Mortars burst among the charging ranks. When the smoke cleared, the sand was littered with bodies. One Marine officer wrote later, "They said this island could never be taken." By that night, we knew it would never be given. As dawn rose on June 16th, the Marines began pushing inland, toward the airfields, the ridges, and the heart of Saipan itself. They didn't know it yet, but they were stepping into something worse than any beach landing. They were walking into a nightmare of caves, cliffs, and death. And for the Japanese garrison, it was only the beginning of their end. The sun rose over Saipan on June 16, 1944, through a haze of smoke and ash. The beaches were littered with wrecks, burned-out landing craft, shattered tanks, and the bodies of men who never made it past the surf. Behind the Marines, the ocean boiled with ships. Ahead of them, the island loomed like a wound, dark hills crawling with hidden fire. The assault inland had begun. The Japanese had no intention of surrendering the island. Their commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, had already issued his orders. We will fight to the last man. We will kill 10 of the enemy for every one of us. To him, Saipan was sacred ground, the line between the emperor and annihilation. Every inch of it was fortified. The Marines called the first obstacle Hell's Pocket, a nest of caves and ravines honeycombed with machine guns. The air was thick with heat and the smell of cordite. Japanese soldiers fired from tunnels invisible to the naked eye, then vanished underground before the Marines could return fire. Every advance was a duel of sound and shadow. A burst of fire, a scream, silence. Then another ambush. Flamethrower teams moved forward, spraying liquid fire into the black mouths of caves. The screams that came out were unforgettable, raw, echoing, human. Sometimes, explosions from within would collapse the tunnel entirely, sealing both sides inside forever. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions pushed inland from the beaches, aiming for Aslido Airfield, one of the primary Japanese strongholds. They met tanks, Type 97 Chihas, rolling out of the tree line with infantry clinging to their hulls. But the Americans had Shermans now. The two sides met head-on, metal clashing, fire and smoke mixing with screams of men trapped inside burning hulls. By evening, the airfield was taken, and for the first time, American engineers began marking out a new name for it, Isley Field. Within weeks, it would host B-29 superfortresses bound for Tokyo. But on that day, it was still soaked in blood. Further north, the Marines found themselves trapped between two ridges, Mount Tapachau, the highest point on Saipan, and Death Valley, a corridor so steep and narrow it funneled men straight into waiting crossfire. The Japanese defended it with everything they had, mortars, artillery, even suicide bombers charging with explosives strapped to their chests. At night, the sky flickered with tracer fire and burning ammunition dumps. The Marines barely slept. They fought by day and buried their dead by night. Rain began to fall, thick, tropical, relentless. Mud swallowed boots, rifles jammed, but still, the Marines moved forward, inch by inch. They learned the sound of the enemy's voices, the barked orders in the dark, the last desperate cries before a charge, and they learned the smell of the island, wet earth, diesel smoke, rotting flesh. By June 22nd, the Japanese lines had been shattered in the south, but Saito refused to retreat. He gathered his remaining troops, thousands of wounded, cooks, clerks, even the walking dead, and formed them into one last army. He sent out the final message: "We will advance to seek death." The Marines didn't know it yet, but they were about to face the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. That night, the jungle went silent. Then, at dawn on July 7th, the sound began, a deep, rolling chant. It came from the north, like thunder rising from the earth. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers, many without rifles, charged into the American lines screaming, "Tenoheika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" They hit the 105th Infantry Regiment head-on. The Americans fought back with rifles, machine guns, bayonets, and fists. Men were dragged from foxholes and stabbed in the dark. Machine gun teams fired until their barrels melted. Artillery crews turned their own howitzers downward, firing point blank into the charging mass. For hours, the battle was nothing but chaos, shouting, gunfire, smoke, and blood. When it finally ended, more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The American line was torn apart. Entire companies had been wiped out. But Saipan still belonged to the Marines. When dawn broke, the battlefield was quiet except for the buzz of flies. The Japanese army on Saipan was gone, destroyed in a single night of madness. General Saito, gravely wounded, took his own life near his headquarters, leaving behind one final message to Tokyo. "Our spirits will defend the island forever, but our bodies have perished." By July 9th, after 3 weeks of fighting, the battle for Saipan was over. The impenetrable fortress had fallen. But victory came with a price. More than 14,000 Americans killed or wounded. And what came next would haunt both sides forever. Because on the cliffs above the sea, the civilians of Saipan, Japanese settlers, Okinawan workers, and Korean laborers faced a choice: surrender or jump. The wind howled across the cliffs of northern Saipan. Below, the waves smashed against black volcanic rock, white foam spraying into the night. And above, the sound of gunfire faded into something worse. Cries, screams, then silence. It was July 9th, 1944. The battle for Saipan was over, but for thousands of Japanese civilians, the nightmare was just beginning. Word had spread through the caves and villages. The Americans were coming. Propaganda from Tokyo had told them what that meant, that surrender meant torture, mutilation, death. They believed it, completely. As U.S. Marines advanced toward Marpy Point, families began gathering at the edge of the cliffs. Men, women, and children. Some held hands, others clutched grenades or family photographs. Japanese soldiers, too wounded to fight, helped carry the civilians there. The Americans called it Suicide Cliff. The Japanese called it Gyokusai. The honorable death. Marines tried to stop them. Through bullhorns and translators, they shouted, "Don't jump! You're safe! The war is over!" Some pleaded, some cried, some waved food and water, but the fear ran too deep. Mothers threw their children first, then followed. Families leaped together into the sea, their screams lost in the wind. Others detonated grenades against their chests, vanishing in clouds of smoke. One Marine, standing at the base of the cliff, later wrote, "We saw them up there, hundreds of them. Then they began to fall. We couldn't do anything but watch." For days, the cliffs echoed with the sound of despair. The sea below filled with bodies. And when the last gunshot faded, the Empire's illusion died with it. Back in Tokyo, the news of Saipan's fall hit like a thunderclap. The loss meant something unthinkable. For the first time, American bombers could strike the Japanese homeland directly. The distance from Saipan to Tokyo was 1,300 miles, well within the range of the new B-29 superfortress. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, architect of Japan's war, resigned within days. The myth of invincibility, the very soul of imperial propaganda, had been shattered. For the Japanese high command, Saipan's loss was more than military defeat. It was spiritual collapse. For the Americans, it was the turning point. Engineers swarmed the island, transforming its airfields into fortresses of their own. Within weeks, rows of B-29s lined the runways, gleaming in the Pacific sun. From here, the war would no longer be fought on distant islands. It would come to Japan itself. The Marines who survived Saipan were exhausted beyond words. Their faces hollow, their uniforms blackened by smoke and rain. They had fought in conditions no man should ever endure: caves, mud, hand-to-hand combat, and nights filled with the cries of the dying. When the last shots fell silent, they walked among ruins. The palm trees burned to stumps. The fields churned into wastelands. The air heavy with the smell of death. A correspondent who arrived days later wrote, "The island is ash and bone. Every hill is a grave, every crater a tomb. And yet, from that ruin, the Americans built victory. From Saipan's shattered coral runways, the 20th Air Force would launch the bombing campaign that would burn Japan's cities and bring the war to its doorstep. The Japanese had believed Saipan was impenetrable, a wall that would hold forever. But the Marines had torn that wall down, inch by inch, at the cost of thousands of lives. Saipan was more than a battle. It was the death of an empire's illusion and the birth of America's final offensive. When the B-29s finally lifted off from Saipan's runways, their bellies filled with bombs bound for Tokyo, the men below could still see the cliffs in the distance, silent, black against the sky. And they knew what those cliffs meant. They were not just the edge of an island. They were the edge of a world that no longer existed. The sea was calm again. The guns had gone silent, but Saipan still smoldered. The jungles were gone, the ridges scarred black, the beaches littered with wreckage that once had names. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan was looking at defeat, not as a distant rumor, but as a certainty. From the ashes of Saipan, the United States had built an airfield unlike anything the Pacific had seen before. Concrete runways stretched across the island, long enough to launch the massive B-29 superfortresses. Each one could carry 10 tons of bombs and reach Tokyo itself. When the first B-29 lifted off from Isley Field, its engines roared like the sound of judgment. For the men watching from below, it felt as though history itself was taking flight. That plane would not be the last. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the U.S. unleashed an air war that no nation had ever experienced. Entire cities burned in a single night. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all turned to fire. The empire that had once believed itself divine now faced annihilation from the sky. A storm born on the same island they swore could never fall. In Japan, the shock of Saipan's loss tore through the government like an earthquake. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo stood before the emperor and accepted blame for the disaster. Within days, he and his entire cabinet resigned. The Japanese public, kept in the dark for years, finally heard the truth. The war was no longer on distant islands. It was coming home. The fall of Saipan marked the beginning of Japan's unraveling, the collapse of faith in the imperial army, and the first whisper that perhaps the war could not be won. Yet even then, surrender was unthinkable. Even after Saipan, even after Tinian, even as B-29s filled the skies, the imperial command vowed to fight to the last man. They still believed that sacrifice could somehow change destiny. But destiny had already changed. For the Marines who survived Saipan, the victory carried little joy. They had seen too much, buried too many friends, and fought for ground that looked more like hell than earth. They remembered the heat, the stench, the sound of the caves collapsing under flame. They remembered the cliffs and the sight of people throwing themselves into the sea. When they were finally rotated off the island, the ships carrying them away past those same cliffs. Men stood at the railings, silent, watching the waves crash below. No one spoke. Some saluted. Others just stared, lost in thought. One Marine wrote home, "We didn't take Saipan. We survived it." And that was the truth. Saipan was not the largest battle of the Pacific. It wasn't the bloodiest, but it broke Japan's back. It opened the door to the Mariana Islands, the key to the B-29 campaign that would devastate Japan's cities, cripple its industry, and bring the war to an end less than a year later. When historians later marked the true turning point in the Pacific, they didn't look at Midway or Iwo Jima. They pointed to Saipan, the moment Japan lost not just an island, but the war itself. Because after Saipan, the outcome was only a matter of time. By the summer of 1945, from those same runways that had once been drenched in Marine blood, two final bombers would rise, Enola Gay and Boxcar. Their cargo would end the war and change the world forever. Saipan had been the first step toward that terrible ending, the moment the war shifted from soldiers and ships to cities and fire. When the veterans of Saipan grew old, they spoke of it quietly, if at all, of the heat, the noise, the smell of cordite and rain, of the faces of men who never came home. And sometimes they spoke of that night when the sky burned and the world changed. Because Saipan wasn't just a battle, it was a warning, written in fire, water, and the cost of human will. The Empire thought Saipan was impenetrable. The Marines proved otherwise. In 30 days of relentless fighting, they turned the island and Japan's illusion into ashes. And from those ashes rose the shadow that would follow Japan all the way to Hiroshima. The Pacific burned bright that summer, and the world has never been the same since. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe to our channel and keep the past alive.